Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast at the MIT Center for Real Estate. My name is Robbie Mulcahy, and I'm a first-year student in the Master's of Science in Real Estate program here at MIT. On the pod today, we have Tess McNamara. Tess is an architect and sustainability consultant working at the intersection of design, engineering, and academia. Tess is formerly a senior sustainability consultant at Arup, a global sustainability consultancy, and is based in New York City. She's also on the faculty at the Yale School of Architecture, where I myself actually took a few courses a few years back, though I'm not an architect. Tess, I'm really excited to have you on the pod today. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Robbie. Really excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So I provided a brief introduction of your background, but would love if you could walk us through your education and career and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm both an architect and a sustainability consultant. And these are kind of two parallel, but ideally converging tracks that I've really been on since the start of my career. I went to Princeton for my undergraduate degree where I studied architecture and minored in environmental studies. You couldn't really major in sustainability at that time. But my interest in sustainability in the built environment really started from growing up in New York City, I think. And I went to college really fascinated by this idea of the city as the most natural human habitat. And that sort of over time, many years and many classes later, grew into a passion for sustainable design. And after school, I started my career in engineering as really a project manager or kind of like drafts person. And the firm I worked for, which was Guy Nordenson and Associates, had this side interest in coastal adaptation, coastal resilience. And that was really before it became a big talking point in the city specifically. And I was actually working there, in New York when Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012. So that was a very formative experience for me in the early stages of my career. And it was through some work that came to the firm out of that I realized there was a need for someone that could work with, designers and architects, but who also really understood the science of climate change, and who could interpret climate projections or read flood maps, provide more of that analytical perspective. And I realized that those two groups don't really speak the same language, the designers and the scientists. And if I could be a bridge between those two camps, it might be an interesting place for me to work. And it was really that motivation that sent me to Yale, which is where I got my master's. I don't think we overlapped, but I know your alma mater too. And so I got my master's in architecture and my master's in environmental management from the forestry school, which is now the School of the Environment. So I tried to, keep a foot kind of firmly in each world to really be that bridge. And after finishing that, I finished my requirements for my architecture license a year after graduating, which is a whole topic for a different podcast, and then went into sustainability consulting, where I've been for the past 5 years or so. And I think I am still pursuing those two tracks today. I'm teaching and working with architects, but also trying to bring a more scientific or engineering perspective to the built environment through my research and project work.
Very cool. That's great. I mean, it sounds like your career actually started more in sustainability, and architecture perhaps was like an avenue for you to explore that interest, which I find fascinating. I think maybe these days folks find their way into sustainability as kind of like an add-on, perhaps, to whatever they're already doing or whatever their professional endeavors are.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think architecture was the way to study the built environment at the time. I kind of kept sustainability as a through line through it all.
Very cool. So could you tell us a bit more about Arup for the folks who might not be as familiar? What does Arup do, and what kind of clients does Arup work with?
Yeah, Arup is a global engineering firm. We have, I think it's now over 18,000 employees globally, and we do it all when it comes to engineering. Our motto has been sustainable design is everything, and that trickles through our mechanical engineers, our electrical engineers, our structural engineers. My team is this straightforwardly labeled climate and sustainability team, but that concept really percolates through all of the different groups that Arup has, and we have clients that are private sector, public sector, education, arts and culture. We do a lot of infrastructure, rail. We kind of, you name it in the built environment, and we probably do it.
Could you walk us through an example of a project that you worked on at Arup?
Yeah, sure. So My team is the climate and sustainability team. We really do a bit of everything in this space, but the focus of the industry right now is really decarbonization. And my projects, I try to focus on what I would call a whole life carbon lens to decarbonization. So that means looking at both embodied and operational carbon emissions. Would it be helpful if I define those
That would be great. I was going to
terms? Great.
circle back with you on that.
Okay. Yeah. So embodied carbon accounts for all of the emissions that go into the construction, maintenance, and ultimately disposal of a building. So if you think about a brick, the upfront embodied carbon of that brick and all of the energy and carbon that went into extracting the raw materials, firing the brick, transporting it to your site, and then installing it in the building. And if you think about the embodied carbon of the whole building, you essentially do that accounting for every single material in the project. Operational carbon is the more traditional lens for emissions. So it's the carbon associated with your building's energy use, essentially what shows up on your energy bill. And your building's operational carbon footprint is going to change depending on how much energy your building uses, but also the type of fuel it's running on, whether it's renewable energy, gas, oil, or electricity from the grid. So taking a whole life carbon lens means you're considering both of those things, the operational emissions and your embodied emissions for a building. And that has really led me to focus on building reuse and retrofit, which reduces both types of emissions at once. So to give you a few actual project examples, I'm working on a decarbonization plan for a classic mid-century office building here in the city, 2.3 million square foot building in Midtown, a portfolio decarbonization plan for a large tech company that shall not be named, and the retrofit of a large World War II era complex in Brooklyn, and working on the sustainability and decarbonization plans for the development of Liberty State Park in Jersey City, which is an awesome project that many teams at Arup are working on. So a lot of different things.
First of all, love to hear that there are so many projects going on in New York City. What do those retrofits look like? Like when you're working on these projects, is it you're looking at the roofs, you're looking at the HVAC systems, you're thinking about, if there's a new addition to the building, how the materials for that can be sourced? Like on the ground, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of building, and the era that the building was constructed is going to have a big impact on what they're looking to retrofit. I think we'll talk about office to residential conversions later, but
Yes.
for your classic mid-century building, they typically have curtain walls that need some type of retrofit, often single pane glazing. So we would look at the facade. The mechanical systems at this point are 50 plus years old. So it might include an overhaul or electrification of those mechanical systems to reduce that operational carbon we were talking about. Sometimes these type of retrofits are part of a larger repositioning of the asset. So from the owner's perspective, they're trying to upgrade the building. We've done some projects where it was a full facade replacement, which had great energy impact, but the real motivation was to make the windows bigger, to make, as part of a upgrade across all of the building systems.
Interesting. I'd love to, let's pivot to that that article I think you were just referencing there. So I know you've written pretty extensively in the subject of sustainability in the built environment. Your research has been featured in publications like the New York Times, the New Yorker, Architectural Digest, and Arch Daily. I'd love to dig into that report you co-authored about a year ago, I think, that was picked up by the New York Times about office to residential conversions in New York City. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the report is sort of straightforwardly named Office to Residential Conversions, the Carbon Story.
Ooh, intriguing.
And we really set out to answer a very simple question, which was how much carbon could be saved by 2050 if New York City expanded the range of buildings eligible for office to residential conversions. Office to residential is, a very hot topic in the city right now, and it has a lot of people looking at it from different angles. And what I think a lot of people not in the industry don't realize is that right now most office buildings built after 1960 actually can't be converted by right into housing. And there's a zoning proposal within City of Yes for Housing Opportunity that will expand that eligibility. And that zoning proposal is set to be voted on by the City Council by the end of this year. So we were interested in adding a carbon lens to the discussions that so far were dominated by vacancy rates and the housing crisis, concerns about feasibility, financing, which are all very valid points of debate. But our perspective was that there's a carbon story here worth telling, and that story might provide additional impetus for the city to pass the zoning changes and develop incentives to make the conversions actually happen. So we focused on the subset of buildings that would be made eligible for conversion by the change in zoning that's up for vote right now. And it came to 222 buildings. We developed a typological framework based on decade, floor plate depth, window type, which are all factors that would impact the operational and embodied carbon savings associated with the conversion. So we ended up with 12 typologies, and we assessed the carbon savings for each. We considered things like structural and massing changes that would be needed to optimize deep floor plates for residential use if we were looking at a full curtain wall replacement or just a window replacement, and then a range of energy and electrification improvements that would be triggered as just part of the conversion. And so what we found is that opening up those 222 buildings for conversion would result in a significant window of potential savings. The end result was a 54% reduction below a business as usual condition by 2050. So that business as usual case is if the new apartments are built new from the ground up, and the office buildings are left to operate as they do today. They're not a very high performing set of buildings because they're from the 60s, 70s, 80s. So that 54% is a really significant reduction, even on a building by building basis, but aggregated over the full potential change in zoning, it becomes a very significant absolute figure for a window of carbon savings that the city could basically open up. So it was 11 million tons by 2050, which is the equivalent of annual emissions from 2.3 million passenger vehicles. So very encouraging results.
Absolutely. So if I read the report correctly, it seemed like a lot of those savings, a lot of that 54% reduction came from not building new buildings in the first place, right? The adaptive reuse part of this. How do we actually get there in reality? How do we make sure that by 2050, we can actually implement this 54% reduction? Was your report based on current zoning laws and kind of the current landscape, or are there some big changes that we need to make in terms of public policy or otherwise to get us to that place?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly City of Yes would have to pass to open up Midtown to those conversions, which essentially lifts the FAR cap on residential and allows for bigger buildings to be residential. So I think that's, number one. I think, my goal with the study is really to stay optimistic and to highlight the opportunity, just given where we are with the needed public support. I think, if the housing crisis isn't going to sway people, if the plight of developers isn't going to sway people, maybe like the carbon perspective will, and it's just additional impetus to pass incentives. And I think the office to residential conversion, it's kind of a triple win, right? It's a win for sustainability and carbon. It's a win for developers who need the zoning to be changed to have this avenue out for what is essentially a stranded asset. And it's a win for the city because we can create more housing in transit-rich neighborhoods. But obviously, as you point out, there are challenges. And I think it's zoning and it's cost. And I think right now, the truth is that the cost doesn't really pencil out. If it does, it's for luxury rentals. And I think to mitigate this, we need more federal, city, state subsidy to tip the scales towards reuse and retrofit while preserving affordability. I know that HUD has a large study out right now, which tasked a team of designers and planners, architects to think about the types of incentives that would be most effective in encouraging these types of conversions. So I'm hoping we see something interesting out of that soon. But in New York, can't even do it right now. So City of Yes definitely has to pass. So if anyone listening, call your city council rep if you live in New York, even if you don't, because this is not a New York specific issue, right? Many cities are dealing with this. I kind of feel the large machinations of the construction industry slowly turning towards reuse and retrofit. I see that in the flow of RFPs we're getting. I see it in conference topics. I see it in how design firms are really positioning their work. So I do have some hope that with this new focus, there will be some economies of scale and we'll figure out how to reuse and retrofit at a lower cost. So it will become more of a financially viable option. That's kind of my idealistic take on it, but I'm curious what you think about the financial subsidies.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, first of all, as a real estate development student, I think I have to be optimistic, right?
Yeah,
All
we
real
all have
estate
to be
developers,
optimistic.
it's kind of an intrinsic quality. But I do think you're right that there's this moment right now where there's this cross section of a housing crisis in America at large. Although there's gluts of supply in certain markets in America at the moment, we have this crisis of office values and kind of everybody rethinking what the future of work looks like. And I think
Hmm.
that's still playing out in terms of return to office
Yeah.
mandates and where that will end up shaking out. I think it remains to be seen. But to take advantage of those two things to use this time, right, to implement sustainability measures, right, to say if we want to solve these two problems at the same time, perhaps by doing office to residential conversions, why not bake into that equation also some type of sustainability mandate while we're at it, for efficiency purposes? And because it seems like regulation is heading there anyway, right? If we're refitting or adaptively reusing these buildings, we should take that opportunity now to implement some of these measures. So I'm right there with you. I think
Yeah.
that the financial feasibility side, and I was going to get to this in our conversation, is to me one of the biggest barriers at the moment, right? I think that
Yeah.
developers are interested in making sustainable product. I think that there's a value proposition to be made, especially as down the line, investors are going to have mandates that they invest in sustainable projects, which is going to make funds and individual investors look at properties that have sustainable operations more favorably and more attractive, and therefore they're going to have higher values. So I think that all bakes into the financial equation. I think there's just a big first cost bias,
Yeah.
right, with a lot of these measures.
I mean, I think the thing that excites me about office to residential conversions is you don't even need to be thinking about sustainability and you're still, saving that 54%. We were just assuming standard average costs. And the truth is, with the extent of the renovation required in the conversion, you have to bring the building up to code. And a lot of these buildings are so old at this point, they're of a vintage where the codes were completely different. And so even just that, you're going to see 50% operational savings
Mm.
by upgrades to the facade and an overhaul of the mechanical systems. So it's almost like it's like a sneaky way to get people to do sustainability, which is why I like it. They don't even need to think about it. Um,
No, it's
but
great. I love it. It's like a nudge. I'm a student of economics, and it's funny.
yeah.
This is a really interesting and perhaps weird example, but I noticed I was in the bathroom today, and the flush could either go up or down. And if you
Hmm.
pushed it up, it was like a green flush, right? It used less water. If you
Right.
push it down, it uses more water. And just the direction of which way the right, the lower water use is very important, right? We need to make it easy for people to make these sustainable choices. And
Hmm.
that's a very intentional choice. And so I'm right there with you that if folks or development firms are making these adaptive reuse decisions anyway, we might as well make it easy for them to
Exactly.
implement sustainable choices. So that's great. One thing I did want to get your view on is how the past year might have changed or informed your thoughts about office to residential conversions, because it's been about a year
Hmm.
since this report was published. And, there's been a lot of, there's certainly been success, but there's also been, I think, probably more salaciously, right, the failures of office to residential conversions that you see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or, name your business publication. What do you think the challenges are? What lessons have we learned over the past year as developers actually break ground on some of these office to residential conversions?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really struck me is that it's happening. I mean, this is anecdotal, of course, but my office building where I'm sitting right now in the financial district sold last month to a developer that plans to convert it to residential after their successful conversion of 160 Water Street, which is just a block away. I kind of watched that building transform over the past year. And the financial district has more flexibility in its zoning for conversion. So it's really starting to happen here where it can't yet take off in Midtown. I think, on my commute to work, which is a random walk down Water Street, if you will. I think I passed 4 or 5 conversions within 2
That was
blocks.
a good finance joke, by the
Thank
way.
you. I thought
that.
you might appreciate that. But it is hard from a development perspective. And it's also, I think, challenging architecturally and requires some really creative problem solving to turn these big floor plates that were designed for offices into gracious and comfortable homes with adequate light and air requirements, essentially. One thing we're seeing here is that the success of a conversion will ultimately depend on some fundamentals of the building. So depth of the floor plate, where the mechanical risers are, where the elevator shafts are relative to the facade. Here, our structural and mechanical teams are working on a few conversions right now, but we're also doing a lot of feasibility studies as owners and landlords weigh the changing financial landscape. They're waiting for zoning changes. They're trying to understand the actual cost of the potential conversion. And it's not something you can apply on a square foot basis across any office building. It really does depend on the architectural fundamentals of the building. But I'd be curious to hear your real estate perspective on this, but my kind of amateur market take is that we're only just now hitting the bottom of the slump in commercial real estate. If your average commercial lease is 10 years, you have to think that only now, approaching 2025, have we actually reached the tipping point where the majority of leases signed before COVID in 2020 are actually expired. So my hunch is that in the next year or two, we're actually going to see the market maybe bottom out, which will make the conversions more financially appealing. I'm curious what you think.
No, I would agree. I think that, again, the whole office market kind of remains to be seen what's going to happen, right? I think regardless of what happens, what we are seeing is that trophy office assets are going to be just fine. Nothing's going to happen to those, right? But as you go into your A, B, and then particularly C class office, yeah, I think there's definitely going to be opportunity for reuse of those buildings. There's going to have to be, because the current use just doesn't support, right, the value proposition behind office anymore. So hopefully we'll see that the market starts to rebalance, and there will essentially be a new baseline for the value of those assets. And when folks realize that the highest and best use perhaps is to put money in and make these into a different use, then we'll see these conversions really take off.
Yeah. Interesting.
So if you don't mind, I'd love to pivot here to talk a bit about your role as an academic.
Sure.
We're in the MIT Center for Real Estate here, so we love academia. I really think that research, it's such an important part of this decarbonization story in the built environment. The research that we just talked about that was picked up by the New York Times being among. We need developers, builders, tenants to take action, of course, but I think it's important that we educate those stakeholders about their carbon impact and the ways in which they can mitigate it. I think context always helps motivate folks. So, like I mentioned in your intro, you're on the faculty at Yale. Can you tell us a bit more about your work there, what courses you're teaching, and what research, if any, you're conducting?
Yeah, so I think education is so important. And it's funny, I tell my students that the conversations I have with them about sustainability and decarbonization are basically the same conversations that I have with my clients who I'm also really teaching. And, this stuff gets really wonky really fast. And it's so important to bring folks along so they really feel empowered to go out and action any advice that we're giving them, just like you said. So my class at Yale is basically about everything we've spoken about. It's a weekly seminar called Bad Buildings, Decarbonization Through Reuse, Retrofit, and Proposition. It's a class in the architecture school. It's really geared towards architects. We talk about whole life carbon, so the operational and embodied carbon pieces we talked about in the beginning of the conversation. And my goal in the class is to give the students really the tools, so the vocabulary, the metrics, the general knowledge to go out and make an impact on the carbon footprint of their projects from day one of their careers. In the class, they pick a bad building in New York City, which is, we spend some time defining it, but a building that has poor energy performance, but also that is underutilized in some way. So not operating at its highest and best use, as you mentioned about many mid-century office buildings. And they propose how to repurpose it while reusing and retrofitting it. So there's a really big design component. They're architects after all. They're drawing floor plans. They're making renderings. They're also, though, doing embodied carbon calculations. They're looking at financial payback for retrofit measures. They're ultimately kind of putting together this narrative and this proposal for how to give this building a new life while decarbonizing it and giving the owner a new financial stream to generate a return on the retrofit investment. And, when I was in architecture school, there really weren't a lot of classes on sustainable design. This whole industry has really exploded since like 2019, I would say, is the turning point. The ones that existed were either very dry or very idealistic. Your kind of hay bale insulation or algae facade type classes, which are very important, but not going to help an architecture student make an impact day one of their career on a building. So my goal with this class was to keep it very grounded in real world constraints, to bring students the language that the industry is using right now, and to get them to connect the fact that design choices can directly impact the carbon footprint of their buildings in a way that they can then measure. So it's really fun. The students are amazing, and it's the highlight of my week.
That's super cool. I would love to have you visit MIT for a semester and teach that class here.
Yeah.
We may have a course like that in the architecture school. We do, thankfully, now have required sustainability courses.
Great.
Which
Amazing.
is wonderful.
Yeah.
We'll be taking those next semester in our second semester. So that's excellent. Also, I also love the Yale School of Architecture. I spent a lot of time there, even though I wasn't actually going there.
Amazing. It's a great place. Best building.
Is. Oh, Rudolph Hall.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, so as you know, right, I'm a graduate student, right? We've talked about this a few times now. For me and my peers and those would-be developers and investors listening, what can or should we be doing practically to make more sustainable choices in developing and investing in real estate? Similar to the concept I think you were just talking about that you teach to your students in architecture, is there anything that we should be thinking about, where in the process are we making these decisions? What types of choices should we be making? What type of frameworks should we be thinking in order to make sure that we're, making the right choices in terms of sustainability in the built environment?
Yeah, I think there are things we can do really at every step of the development cycle. So at the start of a project, can you think about reuse? Can you look to renovate an existing building instead of building from the ground up, if that's possible within the goals and constraints of the project? And then in early design, can you optimize your materials and your structure to build less? So to literally use less material, less concrete, less steel. And this can be done through just good structural design. Arup has a great tool called the Circular Buildings Toolkit that helps walk owners and design teams through some key decisions throughout the design process. It's a great tool, so you should check that out. And then I think it's focusing about the right material choices. So can you use something with a lower embodied carbon footprint than concrete, which is often just, the default for so many things? Can you use timber? Can you look at steel or aluminum and specify really high recycled content? Ideally, you're hiring a sustainability professional that can investigate in depth what the right choices are and quantify the benefit of those choices. But obviously, that's not always possible within the budget. And you can do a lot with a generalist knowledge and someone just like paying attention to these decisions that are being made. That was all thinking about embodied carbon. On the operational side, you can look at building efficiency and fuel source. So first, can my building be all electric? Can I design with no fossil fuels on site? No natural gas for heating or cooking. And that's a prerequisite to be considered a decarbonized building in the future. Then can I push my mechanical engineers to really think about system efficiency? A lot of times mechanical engineers just do what they did on the last project. But if you push them, there's a lot that you can do to improve the efficiency of your system. You can think about, where can I move heat around between uses through heat exchangers so nothing is wasted? Can I use heat pumps, which have a much higher efficiency than traditional equipment? There's a lot that can be optimized through just good mechanical design. And then in terms of measurement, you could do a full-blown energy model, a life cycle assessment to quantify how well you're doing relative to a baseline case, but that can be a big lift. And you can also just push your design team to do better than code in terms of performance. So if you're looking at prescriptive requirements and code calls for an R13 wall in the Northeast, can you do better than that? Can you add insulation to have a higher performing facade than what is required at code minimum? And that's kind of a low effort way to say, okay, we're doing better than your typical building.
I love that, especially in terms of just thinking high level, in terms of a framework of what can I do better from an embodied carbon perspective, and then what can I do better from an operational carbon perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's it's a simple way of tackling what is, as you know, I'm sure, a very complex problem. So we're going to move here to the lightning round of our pod. These are a few quick questions with quick answers that I'd love to get your take on. First one, if you could change any one policy at the federal, state, or local level, what would it be and why?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned this. We're missing the upfront subsidy for reuse and retrofit. A lot of the climate policy that's passed is in the form of fines, like Local Law 97 here in New York, or tax credits, like IRA 179D. Neither of these address the upfront cost of improving energy performance, which to me is often the largest barrier to getting sustainability measures into projects. Owners need cash at the start of a project to do the right thing. Technology improvements and proliferation will reduce that initial cost, but it's going to take a while for the market to get there. So I think we need a subsidy to kickstart that initial investment.
Excellent. What's one book, podcast, or person you're listening to lately that's inspired you in either design, business, real estate, sustainability, or the environment?
I'm in the middle of a great book called The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. It's by Gretchen Backe. And it's actually from 2016, which is ancient in sustainability terms, but it covers the history of the electric grid and how we got to where we are today and why there are so many roadblocks for decarbonizing the grid and adding more renewable energy. It's also interesting to think about how the conversation's changed in the past 8 years or so. Great book.
Excellent. Nice. We'll check it out. Similarly, what's the best book, podcast, or person you've ever read or listened to in this sphere, and why?
I think it's got to be Jane Jacobs for me, a classic, the Death and Life of Great American Cities. I was first introduced to her in college, and it was the first time I really felt like I was reading about like fundamentally what makes a city great and allows it to thrive as its own ecosystem. Short blocks to increase interaction, eyes on the street for safety, dense mixed-use neighborhoods to give people diversity and spontaneity in their day-to-day. It was really describing like my lived experience as a New Yorker, but could be applied anywhere. And it was that, concept about fundamentally designing cities for human nature. And that's always been like really exciting for me. I also think it's amazing. It was written in the 60s as a response to modernist rational planners like Robert Moses and Le Corbusier, but every point she makes basically still holds up 60 years later. She's amazing.
Such an excellent book. I think that should be required reading here at the at the Center for Real Estate, actually.
Definitely.
I think it's excellent for all the reasons that you laid out. What's the best piece of career advice you've ever been given?
I have a great quote: "No guts, no glory." And this is a direct quote from Fiona Cousins, a very inspiring colleague of mine at Arup. She's the Arup Americas region chair, and she kind of said it to everyone in an all staff meeting. But translates to you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. No one's going to hand it to you, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's been really a helpful mantra to me for fighting imposter syndrome and pushing myself to take a leap and do something that feels uncomfortable, because I think that's how you grow.
Great advice. Lastly, what advice would you give to those listening who might be earlier in their careers in development, consulting, sustainability, or investment than you are now?
Yeah, I think especially in careers in the built environment, experience is everything. It's not like tech. You can't, move fast and break things. You have to literally build things slowly and carefully so they stand the test of time and are safe for human occupation. So I remember, I have a lot of friends in tech and feeling at the beginning of my career very stuck, that it was such a long road until I could be a decision maker or a leader. But really, you blink and 10 years go by and suddenly you're a lot closer. So I think my advice for anyone in this industry is just, stick it out, take it a year at a time, and it's definitely worth it in the end.
It's great. Thank you. Well, Tess, this has been very, very fun. Any parting words, or are there any ways our listeners can follow you or your work at Arup?
Yeah, sure. I think Arup posts really interesting research reports on our homepage regularly, so you can definitely check that out. Our communications team is very active on LinkedIn. You can follow me there as well.
We will. We certainly will. Well, very cool. Thank you so much for your time again. And thanks to our listeners. Keep tuning in this season for more interesting conversations with professionals like Tess. I'm Robbie Mulcahy. We'll see you next time here at the MIT Center for Real Estate.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning into another edition of Meet the Visionaries podcast. And please remember to stay tuned for future episodes by subscribing to our podcast or follow us on social media by visiting cre.mit.edu to learn more. Until next time, take care, listeners.